On today's episode of SOS Creativity TV and FM, we're going to be looking at 3 things to avoid when creating your brand. Before we jump straight into it, let me tell you a quick story of Gap. Yes, the clothing retailer Gap. So over the years, they've cemented a great logo, a great brand identity, and for whatever reason, they decided to change that up. And safe to say, because of the confusion, they changed it back, they revert back within 6 days, which is what's prompted this topic on giving you 3 things to avoid when creating your brand. And with that being said, let's jump straight into today's topic. The first thing to avoid is not being consistent. Let me explain what I mean. So think about it. In the modern era, there are 1,000,001 different platforms that users can find your brand on. So whether that's on Facebook, whether that's on YouTube, whether that's on podcasts, whether that's on your website, whether that's on offline materials, billboards, advertising, business cards, you name it, there are 1,000,001 ways users can find your brand. So when you're not being consistent, that has a negative impact on your brand because you're not recognizable and people don't know who you are. But when you're consistent with the branding, whether that's by making sure you use the same colors, for example, whether that's by making sure you keep the typography, the spacing, the font, everything that surrounds your brand, which by the way, a brand's developed over the long term, but once you keep things consistent, your users are able to recognize your brand, which means they can spot you from a crowded place. When they do that, you're going to be able to grow. Which leads me to the second point, which is not creating strict brand guidelines. What that means is when you create brand guidelines, you're able to avoid the first point that I talked about, which is not being consistent. Because within your brand guidelines, it's a documented way that your brand should be used. For example, the type of logo and what position they should be used in, the type of font that should be used, what color should be used, the spacing that you have, your logo shouldn't be oriented in a certain way, and so on and so on. A brand guidelines helps you keep your brand consistent, which by having that, you avoid one of the fatal mistakes when creating your brand. And finally, the last point is not understanding the power of your brand, which lead me back to the story that I opened this video or podcast, depending on what platform you're listening on, with. You look at the Gap story. They forgot to realize the power of their brand when they decided to make a drastic change to their logo, which they ended up reverting back to within 6 days. Your brand is created over time. It's not just the logo, it's everything that surrounds your brand. Your logo just acts as a focal point to your brand. So these are the 3 things to bear in mind and make sure you avoid when creating your brand. I'd love to hear from you. What is the best brand that you have seen in the last 2 months? Leave them in the comments and I will get back to you. My name is Stephen and I'm the director of SOS Creativity. Till next week, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and bye for now.